I'm Isabella Clark from Publica Think Tank. Here at Publica, we are all about people and relationships. Publica is a Christian think tank dedicated to supporting flourishing relationships, families and communities in Australia and beyond. We do that by researching, writing and communicating about the challenges facing our Australian communities today and advocating for practical solutions and public policy initiatives to address these challenges effectively. I'm speaking with Sam Farren today, who is a youth and young adults pastor at Crossway Baptist Church here in Melbourne. Sam has been in pastoral ministry for over 8 years, working with children, young people and families. Sam completed his theological studies at the Melbourne School of Theology, and in his current role, he oversees pastoral ministry involving over 400 young people and 150 young adults. Sam, thank you so much for being here with us today and speaking to Publica on the topics that we're going to cover today.
Thanks for having me, Bella. Really appreciate it and really looking forward to a conversation today.
Oh, that's great. So, Sam, perhaps you can start by telling us some more about your role as a youth pastor and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis for you.
It's a great question. Changes every single day and every single week, but a lot of it is like pastoral care, leadership, discipling of those young people. So we focus on kind of the high school age brackets, so year 7 to 12 are the ones who are kind of under our care. So that's about sort of 12 years old through to 17, 18 years old. And then we oversee a number of young adult leaders of those young people as well. They range from 18 through till about 30 as well. And so day to day is we run programs for those young people during school terms on Friday nights as well, like worship services, church worship services, think. But then we also have a bunch of work that we do in like local schools as well. And so we're pretty active in working with chaplains and wellbeing teams in a couple of local schools particularly. So we spend a fair bit of time sort of working with them, trying to develop programs to connect with their young people as well and to look to connect them into sort of thriving church communities. And then a lot of it is like sort of quite personal pastoral care as well. Crossway is a large church environment, and so we spend quite a lot of our time working out how to make that sustainable and scalable so that people don't feel like they're just a fish in a really, really big ocean full of people, but so that people feel like known and seen and valued. And so I spend a fair bit of my time working with people on our team, those young adults who can then go on and then care for the kind of smaller group of young people that they're looking after in the youth ministry. So it's a unique job. It changes every single week. There's always new and different demands. It's in a people business, and people are different each and every week. So. But yeah, it's really exciting, and it's a privilege for me to be able to have this role.
So I really wanted to start by looking at the issues of loneliness and community. So looking at the research around young people today, it shows us that we're in an epidemic of loneliness. And perhaps surprisingly, the research shows us that the loneliest age category are the under 30s, particularly 18 to 25s. We know that mental health amongst young people is at crisis point. This has been recognised internationally. And these findings in research are really important for an organisation like Publica. We know that friendship is the core human relationship beyond the family, and friendship and relationships are so, and having a web of rich social connection is so important to human flourishing. And so, Sam, I really wanted to ask you to reflect on drawing on your experience working with young adults. Are you seeing these kinds of issues with loneliness and social isolation with these young people?
Yeah, profoundly so, Bella. It's a hugely prevalent issue, as you say, probably the most prevalent issue in society, but particularly so in the church as well. A lot of my experience with kind of pastoral ministry and pastoral care is on people finding it challenging to turn up to social events because they don't know who they're going to be able to connect with and speak to. In maybe generations past, where it was a bit more commonplace to make a new friend when you walk into a room where you don't know anyone. And I think there's a bit of like a coming off the back of COVID here that this generation is finding really, really challenging to even just simply walk into a room and make a new friend. Seems like this huge mountain of a challenge that young adults and young people find it so challenging to get over. Not just because of COVID, but COVID was a hugely significant thing, as we know, in terms of like changing the amount of face-to-face sort of intimate personal conversations that people had to all of a sudden interacting mostly through screens and phones and text messages. It's profound, to be honest, even the amount of times that I see face-to-face conversations go back to like text messages, and text messages are just becoming like the main way that young people communicate. And you can't get tone, and you can't get sort of that level of intimacy and connection that you can in a body language in a face-to-face conversation. And young people and young adults will opt for that more than they would going out for coffee with someone, having a conversation like this with another person where you can sort of see their eyes and you can get their tone and body language, as you say. And so I think it's become easier for people to remain a bit more distant. And so they're sort of a bit more content to stay in that sort of comfortable zone where it's like, it's less scary for me to sit at my house and text someone, or it's less scary for me to not go to that social event than it would be for me to choose to opt to go to that social event and sort of put myself out there, not knowing who I'm going to see, because as you say, I don't know if I have this thick web of relationships, or maybe I used to have a thick web of relationships prior to the pandemic, but those relationships are a little bit more frayed, a little bit more distant, because as we know with relationships, you have to put work into them to maintain them and to maintain that level of connection. And there's a lot of young people, teenagers, young adults who I guess are sort of out of practice in kind of my experience and anecdotally kind of what we're dealing with in the church context. People are out of practice in kind of human conversation. And something as simple as like, how do you help make a friend is strangely becoming something that I feel like we as the church and leaders in church environments have an opportunity to speak to, where maybe a couple of decades ago you would have gone, oh, that's just sort of common human practice, knowing how to make friends. People don't know how to, or maybe there's an added burden, an added hurdle of like fear or anxiety that didn't used to exist in the first place around sort of maintaining those existing connections, but then also fostering and developing new ones. So it's a hugely significant pastoral thing that I'm experiencing at Crossway for sure.
Sure. What we saw at Publica was that when COVID hit, it almost seemed to act like an accelerant on the fire for issues that were already there. And it accelerated things to a degree, there's no doubt about that. But our sense very much is that these issues were certainly present, and they have become worse, and they're continuing to become worse. And so I'm curious as to your insights around what is it that makes it so difficult for young people to make the sorts of connections that they need to make. You know, you've talked about social media being a significant factor. You've talked about social anxiety. Did you want to expand on any of those concepts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of those two things are quite interconnected, to be honest with you. Generation Z and then Generation Alpha is kind of the age demographic that I do a lot of ministry with. And this is a generation that kind of didn't know a time before smartphones. So they have grown up with smartphones from when they were kids. They had iPads when they were 1, 2 years old, all that sort of stuff. And so their grid of like a worldview outside of having that screen in front of your face and just constant bombardment, to be honest, of both information but also what feels like social connection but isn't actually social connection. They don't know a time before that. And so one thing that I think makes it challenging for people is the polarized nature of kind of what we see on the internet and what young people will be experiencing through social media. That would be one thing that I would feel like would make it incredibly challenging for them to risk sort of developing a new social connection or risk putting themselves out there to try to develop and foster those friendships, because there's risk in putting yourself out there that they would see countless times on social media, people risking themselves, putting themselves out there and being cancelled or being shut down or having all this hate thrown on them from people who might not even know them but are just commenting on a post that they made or reacting to a story that they made on a social media platform. So there's an element of unknown that exists on the other side of kind of putting yourself out there to develop a social connection that I think is pretty crippling, to be honest, for a bunch of young people. Like, I can think anecdotally of a number of different teenagers and young adults that I've chatted with over the past couple of years who have experienced that personally, of kind of putting themselves out there, trying to develop a new friendship. That young person that they're trying to develop a friendship with, understanding that they maybe hold a different viewpoint to them on some sort of political issue, or maybe they have a different family background to the background that they have. And it's just pretty immediate, like, shut down in that situation, which it's like you put your hand on the frying pan, it's burnt, you don't want to go near the frying pan again. I feel like there's an element of that when it comes to like cultivating friendships, is if there's a bad experience once, then that kind of labels it for young people a little bit, because there's just this added level of anxiety around not wanting to be shut down and not wanting to be rejected by the social circles that they're trying to develop themselves in.
It seems to speak to me about resilience and the role of resilience, which is critical in, getting through day-to-day life, but also in developing and maintaining friendships, and also being able to engage in relationships where there is an element of rupture and repair and moving forward. Yep. That's all normal and natural parts of relationships. So I wonder whether resilience is a factor in that. And you also spoke about how young people are kind of having this connection, often via social media, that feels real, but how deep and how real is that connection actually? I think that, friendships that are based around social media and the interactions that we are having on social media, they're not deep, they're not vulnerable, there's no genuine intimacy involved in those friendships.
Yeah, totally would 100% agree with you. I think it even comes back to what we were touching on before around the nature of those interactions and the way that they are just not human interactions in the way that a personable in-person interaction is. Like young people will text each other back and forth for hours on end. Again, I'm just thinking about examples of kind of pastoral ministry that we've had recently. For hours on end, they're kind of the messages app on their screen time is just the most used app that they possibly have. And it feels like you really deeply know this person because you're sending them hundreds of texts a day. But you never actually maybe get to like a deep and personal conversation. And I think that there's an element of trust that exists there when you're just sort of messaging someone's profile picture. It's very different than if you're able to look someone in the eye, and there's more risk associated with that, certainly, because there's a higher chance that you could enter into conflict there, kind of what you were getting at as well. It's the very real stuff of human relationships that are really important. Conflict's a normal thing, and we need to help our young people and young adults learn how to process that in a really, really healthy way, rather than just outright try to avoid that. And I think going back to like just cultivating social media friendships, connecting with people online, is maybe a way that young people are trying to avoid the conflict, the natural, normal conflict that happens in human relationships and human behaviour.
Because if you're texting someone and there's some kind of issue arising, you can spend half an hour responding to a text, but when you're having those kind of interactions in person, it's very different. It teaches you a completely different skill set of how to manage those interpersonal relationships in whatever context that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and super needed and super important. It's, again, coming back to the sort of the effort that needs to be put into those things. It's a muscle that has to be flexed, I think, and that's definitely been our experience in terms of pastoring young people coming out of COVID, is the muscle just atrophied with that. The muscle just really atrophied with both like cultivating new friendships, but also the way that young people healthily manage conflict and relational dynamics is where maybe muscles used to be stronger, they atrophied, and because they've atrophied, it feels harder to go back to that. It's harder to lift that weight again, and so it's our responsibility, I think, to sort of not hold hands necessarily, but walk alongside young people as they sort of get back to the habit of going, okay, I am going to have this conversation in person with this person rather than text that person that thing. Like it requires more risk to be able to go to have a conversation with someone in person. But that's where flourishing lies, right? That's what you're talking about, human flourishing. It doesn't lie in sort of distance. Again, countless examples of that.
So Sam, you've spoken about a lot of the issues that young people are facing in terms of cultivating friendships. Social anxiety is clearly a really big factor in that, and that makes a lot of sense given what we know about the mental health issues and the mental health crisis that young people are facing today. So can you talk to me about, when you have young people presenting with these issues, what are some of the helpful things that you do as a youth pastor to help guide young people through these issues?
Yeah, good question. And And you're right, it's really, really prevalent, and it's like we've been talking about it before, but COVID's just made it exponentially so. Like it's increased social anxiety to a point it's just pervasive. Like it's affecting more kids than it used to affect in sort of 2019, pre the pandemic, and kids who used to have social anxiety, it's just heightened now. We're regularly having conversations with parents who are like, I can't get my young person to leave the house, or my young person just wants to sit in the car park and sees all these big crowd of people and doesn't want to come in when they drive into the car park at church, which is like it's full on, and it's challenging for a young person to go through that. Crossway's a large church environment, and so there's all sorts of different things you can try. I don't think there's a silver bullet to curing social anxiety necessarily. That'd be a rich person if they ever figure that out. But we basically try to make it feel as small and personal as possible. It's definitely the most effort as far as like different strategies and things like that. Like you could be a large church or a large community type environment and try to have like the program and the structure just right and just perfect, so it's like the most attractive it could possibly be. But we found that to be pretty fleeting, like short-lived, and so we try to make sure that every young person who kind of comes into our environment has a small group that's led by one of our young adult youth leaders, so someone who's sort of 5 to 10 years older than them, a bit more life experience to them, but leads a group of their peers of maybe 3 to 6 of them, who are same age, same stage, and they know each other's names and they know each other's stories, and they can recall life events that have happened and follow that up in that process as well in those small environments. Young people who have their name known, their story known, their face recognised when they walk into a sea of people, we've found like resilience levels in those environments to be much higher than a young person who just walks into a sea of people and is here because they're excited and they're energetic, versus young people who are known on a personal and intimate level. And like I was saying before, it's a much more effort, that strategy. It takes much more work, particularly when you have, as you said, like 400 young people coming on a Friday night to be pastoring. But as far as like lasting fruit and lasting healthy relationships, it's by far the most effective way to go about things. So we're willing to put in the effort for it.
And I mean, Sam, what we know about loneliness is that it's not actually about the amount of time that you spend on your own. You can spend a lot of time on your own and not be lonely, but it is about the extent, the amount of quality relationships that you have in your life and the amount of quality time that you're able to spend with key people who are invested in you. And so you're telling me that you guys have created a framework here at Crossway where you're able to create those rich and meaningful connections with young people, and that really seems to create a model for them around how to be in relationship and then how to kind of that flows from there.
Yeah.
It strikes me that at times many young people see entering an intimate partnership as something that could be a cure for loneliness. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yep, absolutely. So we pastor high schoolers here, but also young adults as well, and so I do quite a lot of work with 18 to 30-year-olds. And lots of them are entering into those sort of intimate romantic relationships around that life stage, getting engaged, getting married, all those sorts of things as well. And again, I'd be able to throw out some anecdotal stories to you of some environments, some relationships that are like really flourishing, and 2 people have come together at exactly the right time and they've both thought about it and it's a good decision. I'd equally be able to present you with some opportunities of people who have entered into it too rashly because it's kind of almost a secure, locked-in way to get rid of loneliness, even particularly when people are progressing from a relationship towards engagement and marriage as well. It's almost like people are seeing that as like a locked-in way to have sort of that need for intimacy filled in their heart. I was having a conversation with one of our youth leaders a couple of days ago, even just talking about the distinction between wanting to not be lonely versus wanting a covenant with someone, which as Christians, that's kind of the grid that we have for marriage. It's like this eternal promise that you have with someone, and there's a difference between those two things. There's young adults that I know who are my age who have already been divorced, like married and divorced in their early 20s, which is heartbreaking to hear, and I know those people, and I've heard those stories, and I know that, and what they reflect is, I was looking for a friend, I was looking for intimacy, I was looking for a hole to be filled, and that's what that relationship became for me, rather than wanting a lifelong partner with that person. So it's really sad, but yeah, we definitely see that quite regularly, and it's a pervasive pastoral challenge at the moment.
It's really my sense that the best way to enter into a long-term committed relationship is to focus on being an incredibly healthy single person who is thriving in their single life and has a web or a network around them of interesting and rich and vibrant relationships in terms of their friendships and family. What advice would you give to single people about how you can thrive really well in that single stage of life? Even if you do want to be in a long-term relationship one day, how can you thrive as a single person?
I always come back to, I heard a quote recently, which was, "The world is currently full of lonely people who are afraid to make the first move," which it paints a picture for me almost of like this, people just sort of looking at each other going like, who's going to be the first one to jump in the pool? Because I don't be the first one to jump into the pool. Like I'm gonna wait for that person to text me. I was the last person to send a text. Even though I kind of want to see them and want to catch up with them and want to develop a relationship with them, there's a little bit of like a dynamic here. And so I'm just going to wait for that person to reach out to me. And when everyone in the world is doing that, no one spends any time with anyone, and relationships aren't cultivated, and that's where I think we get to like the loneliness epidemic that we're kind of dealing with at the moment. So I say that quote more than times than I can count to young adults that we're kind of journeying with and pastoring, and just going like, don't be that person. Like, be someone who's different to the world around you, and be someone to send a text or give someone a phone call, even if you don't want to have a coffee with them, just to ask kind of how they're going and what's going on in their life. And we're a church and Christian person, so just like, how can you be praying for that person? What's on their heart, and how can you be journeying alongside them? So again, it's like a muscle that's atrophied, that sort of going out of your own way to connect with someone, rather than sort of, no, I'm just going to passively sort of let the world come to me and let people come to me and let social connections come to me, rather than being willing to be like an icebreaker in social situations and go, I'm gonna take a deep breath and have a bit of courage here, and I'm just going to text you, and I'm going to start to develop this relationship with you, because chances are the person on the other side of that communication is probably feeling a similar sort of thing and actually wanting to cultivate a relationship with you, but you're both sitting there with your hands in your pockets just going, who's going to be the first one to do it? Who's going to be the first one to do it? And so I spend a lot of my time encouraging young adults to do that, is be willing to be a bit of an icebreaker, because people really value icebreakers in social situations. And so I found that healthy before I kind of entered into my intimate relationship that is now my wife, is just to be active in cultivating those, particularly for me, like strong male friendships, because they were really, really important still to this day, like part of who I am, and kind of that thick web of social relationships you're referring to before. Don't be afraid to make the first move. That's what I always tell young adults.
Absolutely. And overwhelmingly, as you've said, the barrier is psychological, and I think that 99.9% of the time the response is going to be positive. Yeah. Okay, so let's move now to having a discussion about intimate partnerships. Some of the trends that we've seen in this space are that less people are getting into intimate partnerships in general. That's either getting married or living in de facto arrangements. There's been a decline in the number of people who are finding or choosing long-term partnerships, but there's also been an increase in the breakdown of relationships as well once you are in them. And what we know is that of those who do form intimate partnerships, whether that be getting married and having children or living in de facto arrangements, we're now doing that at a much, much later age than what we used to several generations ago. Do you feel that these trends are relevant to the young people that you work with? And can you talk to us about some of the issues that you see with the formation of relationships?
There's some stuff that's like relevant crossover-wise, but I think there's some stuff that's a little bit different in maybe like a church context as well when compared to like outside of a church context. So as a pastor in a church context, there's like obviously a huge number of young adults that we kind of pastor and lead who are getting into those like intimate relationships kind of what we were alluding to before as well, some of them maybe like a little bit too hastily or a little bit too early as well, because there's some sort of loneliness that they're looking to sort of band-aid over or cover or fill as well, and the intimate relationship is kind of part of that. But then at the same time, I think even within those kind of relationships, there's definitely an element of like waiting until later to get married, for example. So there's a number of different young adults that I can think of who are having like 2, 3, 4 year long engagements, for example, because something as simple as like the financial burden of getting married, of looking to buy a home, of like buying cars, all these sorts of things that come with like establishing an intimate relationship with someone. Those are huge hurdles for people in intimate relationships.
That's a really challenging issue because, you know, it's a really honourable thing to want to go into a marriage or relationship and set things up for success and, provide for your family and be in a financially stable position. That's a great thing. It's virtuous. But we are living in such challenging times in terms of housing affordability and all, inflation, all of these other issues that are affecting everyone at the moment in society. It's tough.
Yeah, and I think even particularly within like a church grid as well, I think there's this virtue that you're kind of referring to there, where there's an element of sort of like provision for the family that I think is held in quite high regard in a lot of these like relationships that are looking to progress towards marriage that kind of we're experiencing as well. And so people will be maybe hesitant to receive any sort of like assistance to that end from like family or friends or peers as well, around something simple as like helping to fund a wedding or like going towards a house deposit, looking to like get into the housing market. People feel this element of wanting to kind of stand on their own 2 feet in a way that like their generations before them would have been able to. It's definitely different now, as you're referring to, in the way that kind of the affordable interest rates, inflation, housing market, what's accessible for them at the age that they are is very different to what was accessible for their parents at that same age. Absolutely. And I think there's young people who are kind of wrestling with that, who are wanting that earlier than maybe they're able to sort of provide for themselves.
So that's a really significant factor in why perhaps once people find someone, they're delaying, marriage or delaying children or these sorts of things. What challenges do you see kind of a step before that in the actual formation of relationships? And I'm thinking about things like, the social skills and social anxiety stuff, or the viewpoints with which people might think about relationships. So to what extent do people's own dysfunctional or broken family backgrounds contribute to challenges actually forming relationships? Do you want to comment on any of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. Even again, coming out of the pandemic, we saw even in the church, we saw quite an exponential rise in the rate of like marriage breakdown and marriage separation amongst families in the church as well. And so far more young people are growing up with not a nuclear family background, or maybe like a lack of a male role model or a female role model in the household to sort of look up to be led by, and to have as like some markers that they want to then progress through as they step into adult life. So if I think about like young adults that we're kind of leading in the church context, there's particularly quite a lot of young men in the church who maybe dad is not as present as he used to be because there's been separation or divorce in the family, and so they don't have a healthy male role model who is an age or stage ahead of them, who they're able to look to. They're able to ask questions about the decisions that they made when they were their age. They're able to sort of filter their own decision making through a bit of a grid. They're able to be challenged and held accountable by someone who's older than them, who knows the mistakes that they made when they were their age, and then sort of helping them process that as well. So young people are flying a little bit more blind, I think, than maybe they used to, as far as like having a healthy grid and a filter for sort of making those decisions, particularly around like entering into intimate relationships. When's the right time? Can you ever be completely, perfectly ready before you're able to go and take that risk and ask someone out on a date? Or they don't have as much of a grid, or they're actually trying to ask their peers who are at the same age and stage as them questions that they should probably be asking someone who's much older and wiser than them. We see that significantly so, and there's like just a gap in wisdom when you're asking your peer something versus when you're asking your dad something or your uncle something or an older male role model something. Not specifically a male problem, that's just kind of my grid that I'm thinking through for our own pastoral experience.
But I think that, you're tapping into that there does seem to be, there seems to have been a real decline in the extent to which young people have relationships across the generational kind of spectrum. Like those multi-generational relationships really seem to have declined. And I don't think that it's as easy or as common for young people today to have relationships with people who are, in their 60s, 70s, or, whatever, older than their parents and their parents' age as well. There's just been that kind of change there. And part of that is probably about the breakdown of the extended family. You're much less likely to have as much contact with, grandparents, aunties and uncles these days. But I wonder whether there are other things in society as well that are kind of contributing to that gap, and it affects people greatly. It's to our detriment that we don't have that same quality of those relationships.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think now, today, people sort of exist far more transiently than they used to decades ago. So people like move house more frequently, for example, change careers more frequently. And so there's less of maybe an established, rooted, grounded place that people will find themselves in, where their extended family might have been car drives away. People are now spread out across the globe, or maybe the value of coming together as an extended family at significant holidays and things like that, that's less of a value that people hold, and people sort of set up their own families and do their own thing. And so there's a gap that exists there that maybe
the
they
wisdom
didn't.
vacuum.
The wisdom vacuum thing, as well. And that's extended family, but then I think it's much more broad than that as well. It's I think there's it's almost ageism, to be honest. There's progress and growth and a lot of value put on innovation and young people and developments that's made in around the world, Silicon Valley. We're always hitting new frontiers, all this sort of stuff. And then I think a lot of people get sucked up in opportunities to sort of develop a new thing, or a lot of values put on young people. And I think the other side of that coin is there's maybe less value, unfortunately, that's put on the wealth and heritage of people that have gone before you and experienced the things that you're experiencing as well.
And transmission of culture and transmission of relationship skills and all that stuff. It's transmitted by the older generations to the younger, and it's a concern that there is kind of a gap or a breakdown there.
Yeah, I think even going back to you've got to put effort into a relationship to make it work thing as well. Young people, again, in my experience, will just find it easier to speak to other young people, maybe because there's shared interest there in a way that there might not be with someone who is older than them. And young people are generally going to default to the option that's easiest and is going to have the least traction and is going to require the least effort for them to put in. It's going to require effort for them to go and develop a relationship with someone who is a generation older than them, because interests might be different. But there's so many things in life for young people and young adults where we say you need to put in effort for these things. If you want to be a certain person when you grow up, there's some things that it's not going to be easy, and that's okay. You're going to value putting in effort now when you look back on your life in sort of 10, 20 years' time. Which, young people will talk to their peers and their peers won't say that to them, but older people will say that to them. And so young people need older, multi-generational relationships in their life, as well as their peer relationships. We're not saying neglect your peers and only be friends with old people, but you have to have both and, I think.
So are there any particular strategies that you kind of have in terms of encouraging your young adults congregation to foster relationships kind of across the spectrum of, the age, across the age spectrum?
Yeah. I mean, on a simple level, we're just trying to formalise that a little bit in a way that it hasn't been before. So I think maybe like the gold standard young adult in like a church environment would, of their own initiative, go and seek out someone and be like, hey, can you speak into my life because I value you? And it's the gold standard. It's like the top 0.1%. No one asks that question. No one walks up to a random old person and says, can we have coffee?
Yeah.
But we acknowledge that a lot of young adults still feel that in their hearts, even if they're not willing to go and actually be the icebreaker, be the social icebreaker and have that conversation. Young adults want to know what career decision to make when they're faced with like a split path. Young adults want to know if they're ready to get married. They want to know financial advice, like all these sorts of different things. They're hungry for it, even if they're not like verbalizing it. We put a call out to the congregation a couple of months ago and had a whole bunch of adults in there like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s who said, yeah, I could give an hour a month or something like that and have a coffee with a young adult and just sort of talk about life and help them with direction, all that sort of stuff. And so we're in the process of trying to go, this person will connect well with this person. Again, it's a slow, arduous process, but...
But that's fantastic because I think, you know, we're really in a time where these things must be done with intentionality. And, you know, maybe those things were happening much more organically some generations back, and you know, people had the support of their extended family and they had that sort of wisdom around them. But maybe that's not happening so much anymore. So we do have to be intentional, and it's great to see that Crossway is really is doing that and formalising that. Yeah,
we're in the early stages of that process, but we've already seen some fruit with a couple of those relationships. I can think of a couple of young adults who have engaged with a mentor and invited them to attend their wedding, then they didn't know them 2 years before that and things like that. So it's really encouraging and we're hopeful for the fruit that it'll bring. Yeah.
So Sam, once people have found someone and entered into a long-term committed relationship of some kind, what are the approaches that you recommend to support them?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this already, but we're always encouraging young people to have someone a life stage ahead of them in their life to be able to speak into their life, particularly within their relationship, just to be like, let's ask some questions together and let's try and answer them. So my wife and I, for example, have a couple who have 4 kids. We don't have any kids yet. They have 4 kids. And so we're constantly asking them questions about what was this life stage like for you? How do you do it well? How do you help cultivate your marriage well before you go and have children? Because that changes the dynamic. We try and do a similar sort of thing for any young adult who's looking to engage in a dating relationship. We might get them to connect with a newly married couple or an engaged couple and just be like, you've gone through that life stage. What did you learn? What was your experience like? What was positive? What was challenging? What lessons would you give to your younger, older, your past self of how you could do that stage again if you would do it differently? So that's one thing that we always encourage them to do. And then again, I think it comes back to how do you do conflict in a really healthy way? Because when you engage with someone in a vulnerable, intimate way, it's beautiful, but it's also going to create more conflict than if you didn't do that, because it's a new person in your life that's kind of coming into a very intimate part of your life, and so you're not hiding yourself or guarding yourself, you're being your true self in that moment. So helping people do conflict well, work out when's a good time to have a conversation with someone that might not go the way that you want it to. Just really simple, practical things around how do you do that in a healthy way rather than even learning how your intimate partner likes to do conflict versus the way that you do as well, because people are very different in that sort of thing. Some people will try to avoid, some people will try to attack it head on, and so we really try to help coach people how to do that well, even how to communicate well. You don't think it's something that you need to learn how to do well until you start dating someone or being married to someone, and then you realise, oh, yep, I suck at this and I need to learn how to be good at it. So and again, I think often those mentoring type relationships are really helpful to walk through even something as simple as conflict and communication. So anytime we can, we're trying to engage a couple who's a life stage ahead of them and just talk to them, just get in their lives, just learn from them, have dinner together, be part of each other's lives.
That's fantastic, Sam. And I just think, it goes back to having role models for a relationship, doesn't it? And because so many people these days can't look to their own families to have modelled relationship or to have modelled marriage well. It's incredible, like, that you're kind of encouraging it and fostering opportunities for people to find someone who is modelling it well and learn from them when we don't get that kind of directly modelled to us. And I think what you're saying about conflict as well is just so important, because you know, we all have so much to learn in that space. Communication, conflict, it's not necessarily something that's talked about a lot in the church particularly. And so, you know, it is fantastic that you're kind of opening up these conversations within, you know, the congregation of young adults in your church to think about how do we deal with this part of life, conflict, and how do we do it well.
Yeah, and you're so right. It's something that is not talked about often enough, and yet the rate that it actually affects things in our lives is like so high and so significant. And so I think we need to raise the amount that we're talking about these sorts of things, and talking with our intimate partners, but also just talking in our kind of social circles as well, and learning from each other as well. I think even learning from mentors, but also like peer learning when you get to a stage where your own circles are all in like committed long-term relationships or marriages as well. I think it can be really helpful to just be like, what do you guys learn from your experience doing this as well, when you're kind of at maybe like a more mature life stage as well. So yeah, we found it really fruitful to be able to do that. But it's a challenge all the same as well.
Well, Sam, in talking about intimate relationships and partnerships, I think that a key point is turning our minds towards how young men in particular are faring. I'm troubled when I look at some of the research about our young men, which seems to point out that they are struggling at the moment. You know, many young men are really disengaging from life and society. There's a widespread kind of feeling that there is a failure to launch, with many young men not launching into their potential or being able to live out their potential. Mainstream commentary around men is often extremely negative. Masculinity and some of the traits that, you know, come with that, things like high levels of aggression, physical power, strength, these things are portrayed as toxic. And they certainly are toxic, these things, when they're used for purposes that aren't good. But we, as a society, desperately need these things, and we need them in our men, and we need them to be used in service of good. And we can't have a flourishing society if we don't have that. You know, there's other things like young men are increasingly opting out of character building activities like apprenticeships and higher education. There's an epidemic of pornography. There's lots going on for our young men in particular, and then that has a flow-on impact to people being able to form partnerships, because women will often delay entering into a partnership of some kind if they can't find emotionally healthy and mature men. When I think about masculinity and what it is to be a good man, I think about virtues like taking responsibility, courage, bravery, you know, protecting, providing, self-control, self-discipline. And we have such a desperate need for young men to be able to kind of inhabit their identity and develop and cultivate those virtues and use them in service of good. What are the ways that you, you know, as a man who's working with other young men and teenage boys, how do you help to foster and develop young men in those sorts of traits?
I mean, again, it's a lot of the conversation today is like, you got to go slow if you want like meaningful results. And so I think there's been times where we try to like rush people through that process, because really you're talking about like the slow process of development and maturity, and young men need mentors. They need other men who are willing to go like, no, I'm going to be part of your life for a while here, and we're going to journey together for a long time. I'm going to walk with you through some decisions that you make. Some of them are going to be not great. We're going to learn from them. Some of them are going to be fantastic, and you're going to look back on that, go, wow, I thought it was fantastic to have someone in my life who knew my name, who cared about me, and who cared about the person I was going to become. I think we were chatting about this earlier as well. I kind of reflect that question to a lot of the guys who are 16 to 22, is so many of the decisions that you make in that moment have profound impact way later in life, in 30s and 40s and things like that. Even something as simple as, who are you going to marry? Who do you want to enter into an intimate relationship with, and what do you want some of the foundations of that relationship to be? Or what sort of career are you going to have? What's important to you in a career? Are you just trying to financially provide? Do you want meaning and fulfillment for yourself personally? What's your grid for making those decisions? And then ultimately ask the question, kind of, who are you becoming? Because the decisions that you make at that stage of life, that's who you're going to become in 20 or 30 years' time. And so, again, it's almost like a delayed gratification thing, which is so against the grain of what kind of young people are experiencing these days. Like microwave culture, if we want dopamine, we go straight onto Instagram and it's there as much as we want it. Whereas you're really asking, if you're asking the question, who are you becoming, you're asking young men to say yes to delayed gratification, which people rarely say yes to. Like, if they can have the quick and easy option that's going to give us a burst of dopamine or energy in the short term, we're usually going to say yes to that. So it's asking people, I think, a little bit, and again, from a church context, you're talking about spiritual formation a bit here. You're asking people to not get in touch with like their loudest desires necessarily, but get in touch with their deepest desires. And deepest desires often function a little bit more quietly than the loudest desires. The louder desires are more fleeting, more short term. The deeper desires, you're less fulfilling. The deeper desires are more quiet, and you have to sort of take time and take space to become in touch with them. And so, you got to be in it for the long haul with young men, to sort of help them go, this is the sort of man I want to be, and the decisions that I make when I'm 16 are actually going to have a huge effect on the man I am when I'm 35.
You know, Sam, it strikes me as we talk that the biblical model for how we relate to other people is interdependence. You know, we're many parts of the one body, and we do depend and rely on each other. And so much of what we've talked about today really comes back to that. You know, we live in a society at the moment which encourages individualism, it encourages independence, it encourages you to do everything yourself, not to rely on other people, not to trust other people. And it's very, very easy to run along with that mindset. But if we want to do things in the most fruitful and productive way, we actually have to recognize that we do have to rely upon others for our own growth and for our own benefit. And so, it's great to hear those reflections from you about the importance of, you know, young men need to surround themselves with older males who are going to shepherd them through, help them develop into mature and emotionally healthy men. Yeah,
the proof is in the pudding for us, honestly. Like, you can try all sorts of other different strategies, but the times when we've seen young men grow into just like healthy, flourishing husbands and dads in their 30s, almost to a number, almost to a man, you can ask them what worked, like why are you the way you are today? And they're able to list off their granddad, or they're able to list off their church pastor, or they're able to list off their dad, or they're able to list off this like really thriving group of 3 or 4 other men who are at a similar life stage, who are able to journey alongside them and connect with them. And so,
it all comes back to the people who have had that input in their lives.
And the people who have been willing to do it for the long haul as well. I think it's quite easy to get motivated and go like, this is a good idea. Like, the community dialogue and the community narrative is like, you know, let's all bind together and let's all do this together. Even I think and reflect on like some of the ways that happened during COVID is people making like those little like libraries out the front of their houses, like bring a book and things like that, or like putting the little spoons with faces on. There was like such almost like this explosion of like community, like intimacy and things like that. And we're 2 years out And look at how quickly so much of that stuff has like drifted and dissipated and things like that. And so, if we want like lasting change,
it's about consistency.
It is. Yeah. It really is. Yeah, it's about being willing to be in it for the long haul and do it in a sustainable way.
And be in it for the mess.
Be in it for the mess, which is no one wants to hear, right? Because it requires effort, but you do. You have to be in it for the mess, because you don't get the highs and you don't get the joys of people's triumphs if you're not willing to be there for the low moments as well.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, Sam, it's been such an interesting conversation today. I suppose just in closing and thinking about moving forwards from this, is there any messaging that you would give to either church leaders or young people or both about how to kind of move forward in a practical way to address some of these issues like around loneliness, relationship formation, even the masculinity stuff? Is there any other messaging that you want to add just to close our discussion today?
I always think it's like not a very clean-cut, nice answer or anything, but I always think with this sort of stuff that so much of it comes back to like, how much do you want it? How much effort are you willing to put into something? Whether that is a relationship that you have, an intimate relationship, how much do you really want it? How much effort are you willing to put into it? Because what you get out of it is going to directly be related to what you put into it. Strong social bonds. How much effort are you willing to put in? Are you willing to break the ice and be the first person to send the text? Are you willing to go to a social event where you maybe only know one person or you don't even really know that many people? I often think from like a metaphor perspective, like no one likes going to the gym, but everyone feels better after they've been to the gym, because you're like, wow, I'm really glad I like got over the hurdle there, and I'm really glad I did that, and I feel great afterwards. Like exercise is good for me. And I often feel the same way with like effort in social relationships as well. Is like the mountain seems so high to climb before you've done it, of like going to an event or like cultivating a new relationship or asking someone to be a mentor in your life. Like it just seems insurmountable. But when you're on the other side of it, you have a cup of courage and you go, I can do this. I can do this. You're on the other side. Everyone always feels better and go, why didn't I do this earlier? It's not as hard as I made it out to be. So, the answer is really just like, it's okay, you can do it. Like the amount of effort that you put in will directly relate to how much, what reward you want to reap, right, from the biblical metaphor. So that's what I would say to young adults, and even to leaders of young adults as well, is like, how can you help walk alongside people and help them cultivate that sense of courage, like those virtuous things you're referring to before. Just the courage to send that text, the courage to go to that thing, the courage to engage with that mentor, the courage to have that courageous conflicty type conversation with your intimate partner, because it's much better on the other side of those courageous conversations. We have a little term of phrase here that we use sometimes, that everything awesome is on the other side of awkward. And sometimes awkward seems so difficult to get past, but all the things that you want are just on the other side of it. So.
Oh, well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for anybody interested in seeing more of Publica's content, you can access that via publica.org.au. Thanks so much.